Shane wanted me to ask, like, okay, so around Sacred Hate days and stuff.
Oh yeah.
And like as you guys were wrapping up, like what other bands were? First of all, what were like the bands that came before Sacred Hate in the Youngstown scene? Like what were the punk hardcore bands? Like the genesis of it? Like who the heck were those bands?
Well, okay, there were some bands, but you got to keep in mind that like Sacred Hate was not born out of the other bands that were there. We kind of, I mean, I came from Chicago by way of then Pittsburgh.
And like what year?
So 85 that started, and then the Sacred Hate thing started in 87. And then the guys that I hooked up with, Danny and Rick, when we started that band, they'd been spending most of their time in the Cleveland and Pittsburgh scenes, because there really wasn't like a scene at all in Youngstown.
There was nothing.
Well, not that there was nothing, but there was absolutely zero hardcore.
Like
I
what?
mean, nobody was trying to like play fast or aggressive.
What about like, so like it was like even like 79 or something like that?
Well, I didn't live here then.
Right,
so.
right. Okay, but you didn't
from
hear
what
anything.
what I learned, you know, when I got here, the punk rock thing was happening in Youngstown, but it all happened way after the fact.
Okay.
And by the time I got there in 85, there were a couple bands. There was the Trash Boys, who kind of were like a Stooges meets Ramones kind of a vibe that had a little Cramps kind of thing into it. It was just real loose, up-tempoed, but not, you know, was not hardcore at all.
Okay.
You know, and I mean, really, again, 1985, nationwide in major cities, you know, again, I was in Chicago and then, you know, came, you know, through Denver. I was out in Denver then for a little while. Hardcore was in full effect in, you know, a lot of areas. It was not in Youngstown. I mean, bands like the Trash Boys, Up for Adoption was primarily a cover band. They did like, you know, it was like, oh, they did a Dead Kennedys cover, you know, that kind of thing. But their original material was all still like, you know, in that neighborhood, like, you know, 60 kind of BPM, you know, heartbeat, you know, sort of vibe, punk rock, you know, just kind of trashy, sort of like Ramones-y kind of stuff. I mean, there was no sort of like politically driven, socially driven, sort of like way up tempo, you know, double time. Yeah, right, exactly. There was zero, none of that, man. So by the time that Sacred Hate kind of, you know, we all met each other, we're like, oh, you know, I'm familiar with this kind of thing, and we've been going to shows here, and I've been going to shows there and all that, and let's start a real hardcore band. We couldn't find a drummer. You know, originally I was the lead vocalist because I had been doing that in Circus of Death in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, the Electric Banana scene there, you know, that was, I mean, that was like full on, you know, hardcore scene in Pittsburgh. And those guys had been going to shows, you know, Danny and Rick had been going to shows, and over there, even though I didn't know them at the time, they had seen that band, and, you know, we were all familiar with and interested in that style, and that's what we set out to do. So, you know, once we got together, and I mean, this was actually without Danny in the beginning, it was just Rick and I, and I was, you know, trying to be the vocalist, Rick playing guitar, and we had my friend Toby that came in on bass, and he knew how to play that way because, you know, that was, those years were right when that sort of like early, before it was called crossover, was happening, when, you know, some metal bands were emerging, like Slayer,
Like 86-ish.
Voivod, right, Voivod, you know, kind of on the backs of like earlier like Venom and, you know, Hellhammer and shit like that. So he was like a metal guy, but he was being influenced by some of these metal bands that were starting to play fast. And so he was working out, you know, in the rhythm section, but we had no drummer, and every drummer that we tried out in the Youngstown area just had no fucking clue. So we had some guy show up to our rehearsal space and try playing drums, and it didn't work, but he left his drum kit. So since it was sitting there, I just called everybody and said, hey, meet at the space, I'm gonna play drums, which I've never even attempted one time in my life. And I just started playing the drums, and then that's how that happened. So, you know, within a year we were playing shows.
Who would you play shows with in Youngstown?
Well, the first show we did, which was way out of the blue, because it was not a typical Youngstown show at all, and it was just because of our experience, you know, visiting other scenes and being in other scenes. We had befriended the band Corrosion of Conformity, COC, and we managed to get COC to come and play in Youngstown in 1987, I believe that was.
87, okay.
And that was Sacred
That, like
Hate.
Amnesty International.
That's
show.
right. Yeah. Well, the Youngstown Peace Council.
Okay.
Yeah, but they were affiliated with Amnesty.
I see. I just remember
Yeah.
that from a shirt that my.
Yeah. And it was at the Stambaugh Ballroom, which was funny. I was just thinking about that the other day. I saw a picture of something with a nice wooden rail, and the stage in that spot had a wooden handrail around it, because they mostly did weddings and shit like that. And that rail got busted off the stage that night because it was in the way between, you know, the dance floor, as they called it later, the pit, and the band, and people were just basically diving through it.
All right. Well. Yeah.
And broke it right on. The maintenance guy, he was cool though.
Like, so when you would play at the Penguin Pub, what bands would you friggin' be playing with? Was there anybody?
Well, in the very beginning.
Because I remember standing outside the pub because they wouldn't let me in. I was too young to see you guys, so I would stand outside and listen.
Well, in the very beginning, it was like, you know.
Gutter Snipes.
Well, they came along, shortly after Sacred Hate emerged. A local band called the Gutter Snipes, and then a little while later there was another one called they went by three initials, MTS, Morbid Thrill Seekers.
Okay.
Yeah. One of those dudes is dead now. I'm trying to remember who. I can't remember who all was in that band. But yeah, they were you know, they were kind of like on the hardcore tip, you know, in that it was more up-tempoed stuff. Maybe a lot of covers, you know, DC scene covers. You know, like whatever. Yeah. So there was them. There were those bands. They were like local bands that had kind of like jumped on the thing and were digging what was happening, so we were happy to have them. But we just, you know, again, because, and by we I mean Sacred Hate, there was me, and then Rick, and then my girlfriend at the time, Janie, we all had been spending time. Janie came from the Kent, Ohio scene where she worked at JD's Down, which was very important club.
Yeah, I used to go there in high school.
Rick traveled around, going to shows all through the area. Same with me, and I had been in Chicago for some years, and then Denver, and then I was doing the thing, the Circus of Death in Pittsburgh. So we all had connections outside, and we just started like working that shit. And we got that club, Penguin Pub, kind of on the map for touring bands.
Okay.
We were contacting, people we had met and bands we'd seen. We're like, hey, we're booking this club, and by the way, we also happen to be in a band, and we're going to play with you when you come here. And so we were often the opening band for national touring acts, And
so the scene kind of in Youngstown was basically Sacred Hate opening for touring acts.
Yep.
Really, that's what it was, huh?
Precisely. For a long time, and that's what it was.
That's what I remember too. But what came before you don't necessarily recall because you were still in Chicago.
Well, it's not necessarily that I don't recall it, but I can tell you for sure that it was more kind of like this.
Like kind of Ramonesy or something?
More straight up like late 70s punk rock approach that didn't get a lot of like exposure because these bands sort of weren't trying to push out, beyond the bars they drank in. There was the Cedars where some of them would play. There was a place.
Do you remember any of those guys? What bands those would be?
Well,
8 Balls or something? Or?
Well, there was the 8 Balls, primarily a cover band. There was the Trash Boys, like I said, mostly their own material, but kind of, it wasn't really anything too challenging, but it was cool, and I liked those guys. They were all friends. There was a band called Sister Ray, who was a real kind of Lou Reed vibe. I mean, it was kind of like Velvet's, Lou Reed.
What year-ish? I remember them, obviously.
Same, like now, this shit was happening before I got there, but like 85, like when I got there, that stuff was happening.
Okay.
And this was all, when I got there, pretty much exclusively at the Cedars. You gotta just, all this comes with the caveat that my experience in Youngstown doesn't go before 1985. I wasn't there, Stuff was happening for sure. But, back to your original question, the Sacred Hate thing and the hardcore thing really started with us, Sacred Hate, and us bringing our experiences from other cities to Youngstown. We were sort of separate from all that. In fact, at that time, the Cedars, intentionally would not have us play there. They thought it was too much. It was too rough, too aggressive. They didn't want us fucking up their club. Okay, that's fine. So we went to a club that was already fucked up. We went to the Penguin Pub on the north side and fucked it up further. So.
Did Dead Boys come and play Youngstown? And
Well, interestingly enough, right, yeah. But again, that's punk rock, and
right.
And I love me some punk rock for sure, but Steve Bader was from Girard, so the Dead Boys had ties to the area, and their management
that's right.
was based in Youngstown at the time, and yeah, they did a reunion sometime in the late 80s. It might have been like 89, something like that, and they played a show at the Cedar Lounge, and that was great. That was awesome that happened in our town. But again, separate from, those guys weren't hardcore and weren't into hardcore and didn't want to fucking know about
So
hardcore.
it really, you know, that's kind of what it was. Sacred Hate, and then everything that came afterwards really was that was the hardcore bands of Youngstown.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Straight out.
Later came, Jumpers On, Emulators.
Yeah, I mean,
whatever,
I was in a couple bands that
should
came up
have happened.
right as you guys were wrapping up. I was in a band coming up, hardcore band.
Right. So there was a lot of that kind of, which, great, that should have happened. I mean, thankfully, because I would have felt stupid if that didn't happen. Like,
But everyone knew, all those bands were kind of like, they knew Sacred Hate, and they wanted they knew how badass Sacred Hate was, and everyone, there was even a mystery kind of about you dudes too, though.
well,
Just kind of
yeah,
was.
badass or not, I mean, all I can tell you really, we were just kind of ambitious to do it, and we did it when we did it, and it just happened to be first. That's all, that's all.
Sounds good to me.